This is Connor's Comment, and today we're talking about the Minneapolis police. This isn't so much about the murder of George Floyd, but rather the circumstances that led to his death, as well as countless of other Americans who were disproportionately black. But race is not our theme for today. The law is. The Minneapolis police have a long history of police brutality, the most egregious of these cases being the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed black man arrested for a non-violent crime. The officer Derek Chauvin, accompanied by Tao Thao, Alexander Keung, and Thomas Lane, immobilized and suffocated Floyd until his untimely death. Since 2015, the Minneapolis police have used neck restraints like this 237 times. And in 16% of those cases, the suspect lost consciousness. So 44 people. Yet this continued until Floyd's death. Why would they, if they knew that the danger was so prevalent? As an MMA athlete, I know in the right circumstances, it only takes seconds for somebody to lose consciousness. It'll make sense very shortly why the police can do these types of things up until something really traumatic and horrible happens. In 2016, the Minneapolis police revealed changes to their use of force policy. This was following the alleged murder of Jamar Clark, who was allegedly shot after being handcuffed because he was trying to intervene with another arrest, allegedly. Changes needed to be made to use of force. This was to mend the relationship between police and communities after their trust was broken in several high-profile shootings of black men. The changes made last month largely focused on the sanctity of life. With that comes the de-escalation of dangerous situations. The practice was encouraged in the past, but it was never a requirement. Though this is technically a requirement, you'll understand shortly why it's just a suggestion. The current class of 32 police recruits will be the first to receive the new de-escalation training. Other changes include the requirement for officers to intervene if they witness improper use of force by their colleagues and to report to their superior and internal affairs. If your fellow officer witnesses something ridiculous, like the knee on the back of somebody's head, they're supposed to step in. It's written into their manual that this is what they're supposed to do, their policies, their procedures. If you see something like that, then you get in the way of it. You pull the guy off. But for some reason, the other officers didn't act when Chauvin was sitting on the back of his neck. If we look at the fine print, there's no requirement to do anything. That's why this happened 44 times before, where the suspect was choked out. And to top it off with this new policy change, they only said that they were going to be implementing it with the new recruits. They might have done it with others, but they only said that they were doing it actively with the new recruits. And they never said how they would specifically reprimand any officers that broke it. So it's just like, how much do you really fucking care about it? Right? You're going to implement something, but you're going to be like, oh, you know, like we could do something, I guess, when it happens, but we'll just figure out when we get there. Okay, yeah, good call. Former Minneapolis Police Sergeant Jeffrey Gindra, who spent 10 years training officers, said the new guidelines may be out of touch with the realities of street policing. Similar directives have been handed down by the department in the past, he contended. Given the mounted scrutiny that police face today, cops are not just charging into calls right now. You could second guess anybody during any situation, and this kind of codifies that. So what he's saying is that you could judge any single police interaction, that they should have done this, they should have done that, right? Captain Hindsight getting in the way. They've gotten this in the past, even though it's a requirement now, it shouldn't really change anything. And he probably thinks that it shouldn't be changed. It makes sense that Sergeant Ginger feels that way, considering that in 2004, he was allegedly sodomizing a suspect with a toilet plunger during a drug raid. And maybe a little bit more relevant than that, in 2019, after these new policies were put into place, Gindra was with his gun out, pointing it at not one, but two people, asking, "You want to get shot?" At the time this was asked, both were in handcuffs. The utter irony that this guy is judging these new policies that were put into place after a suspect was shot in handcuffs, and he's looking at two of them saying, "Hey, you want to get shot right now?" while they're in handcuffs, pointing his gun at Evans and asking if he wanted to get fucking shot. After pushing Evans to the ground, Ginger turned back to the basement and put the same question to Adams. Sounds like a pretty chill cop, right? Somebody reasonable to have on the force. Police get their definition of power from the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people is to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Unreasonable. But upon probable cause, they can be unreasonable. Be reasonable. Your Fourth Amendment rights in the US are always under the clause of what is considered reasonable, what is unreasonable. Who the fuck knows? It can only be determined by the people who make the laws. You got it. So what is unreasonable and what is probable cause? We can find that definition in the MPD Policy and Procedures, Section 5-300, Use of Force. MPD shall only use the amount of force that is objectively reasonable in light of the facts and circumstances known to that employee in the time that force is used. Objectively reasonable in the time that force is used. Objectively means that it's undeniable. Now, to understand what is reasonable to US police, we need to look at the case Graham versus Connor. Not this Connor. Another police officer named Connor. This case set the standard for all use of force cases in America. Graham was a diabetic who ran into his store, hoping to buy some orange juice because he was having an insulin attack. Realizing that the line was too long, he ran out of the store into his buddy's car and he said, "Let's go, we gotta go to the next one." A cop saw Graham run in and out of the store really quickly and get in a getaway car, and he assumed that a theft was happening. The police followed him, pulled him over, and subsequently arrested Graham. Graham told the police that he was a diabetic and he was in dire need of some sugar because he was having an insulin attack. The police didn't believe him though. They assumed that he was just drunk, even after he fainted. They slammed Graham on top of the car. Graham claimed he had injuries to his shoulder, and then they threw him in the back of the cop car. His friend even came up and said, "Hey, can you give my buddy some orange juice?" And the cop said, "No, not right now. Sorry, he's under arrest." The police eventually got confirmation that Graham didn't actually commit the crime, and then they let him go. But it's not over yet. Graham sued the police because he believed they acted unreasonably in the application of the Fourth Amendment, the search and seizure. What is reasonable? Graham says that him getting thrown on the ground because he's a diabetic is not reasonable. Well, not really because he's diabetic. But he lost. And then he appealed, and then he lost. And then he appealed to the Supreme Court where he lost. The Supreme Court basically said the test of reasonableness under the Fourth Amendment is not capable of precise definition or mechanical application. Its proper application requires the careful attention to the facts and circumstances of each particular case. So what they decided, reasonableness was to be determined by each individual officer. In the manual for the MPD, they claim that there's an objective reasonableness. Objective meaning that there's no question whether or not there was reasonable or it was not. And that's the standard that they hold their police to. Yet with Graham versus Connor, they determined that it's up to each individual police officer to determine what is reasonable and what isn't. So it's really subjective reasonableness. It's of their opinion whether that was reasonable or not. And that's why it's nearly impossible to really get police officers for being terrible. What is reasonable is determined by them, which is determined by their department, which is then determined by Graham versus Connor. Circle back, it's up to the police officer. The MPD policy of objective reasonableness is an oxymoron. What is reasonable can't be always objective. They can't be the same thing. The lines between reasonable and unreasonable are so blurred that's impossible to determine which one is right. This is one amendment in the American Constitution that is under the veil of reasonableness. The entire Canadian Constitution is under the veil of reasonableness. And you might be able to justify in some circumstances why it's important to not have these super mechanical definitions of what is reasonable and what is not in policing, because it's so vague. Changes every single time. There's no two instances that are the same. But it does give the power to the police to determine whether or not what they're doing is okay. If they feel threatened or if they feel that this is reasonable, then they can act upon that. So if George Floyd didn't die during that arrest, it could have been determined as reasonable. Did you die though? It happened 44 times before him, and then somebody ends up dying. Now it's a big issue. I hate ambiguity in law because it always sides with who is determining what the law is. The police act upon and represent our government. Why wouldn't they determine that their own employees are acting reasonable? To say anything otherwise would be an admission of their own guilt in creating and sustaining a system of policing that invokes fear in the people that they were supposed to be protecting. Police are a good and necessary thing. We need police, but it should be a little less subjective to determine whether somebody's knee on the back of an individual's neck is reasonable or not.